Welcome to the Capitol Forum's 6th Antitrust Thought Leaders interview series sponsored by KL Discovery. My name is David Blodner, and we are delighted to have Dan Culley here with us today. Dan is a partner at Cleary, Gottlieb and splits his time between their Washington, D.C. and Brussels offices. We're going to take advantage of his experience to discuss the differences in approach and practices between the EC and U.S. antitrust enforcement authorities. So on the EC process, from a U.S. perspective, it seems like the European process raises some different considerations, specifically due to the fact that there's no real timely judicial review available in Europe. So I'm wondering, when presenting deals to DG Comp, how does that dynamic inform strategy?
Yeah, it makes it tough. I think there's a much bigger reliance as we work with them on ultimately persuading them on the merits, and a little less thinking around the strategic timing of transactions. It's interesting that even though you have largely a very similar group of people working at each of the agencies in the U.S. and in Europe, the fact that you don't have prompt judicial review afterwards, it changes people's behavior, even when they're perfectly have the best of intentions. There are plenty of cases, I know, talking to folks at the FTC and the DOJ, that they had an intuition were a problem, but just didn't feel like they have the documents or the evidence. And certainly, I think you'd see them, if they were unbound from having to go in front of a judge to prove those cases, might make some of the same decisions. So I think we see a lot more emphasis on really working with them in the pre-notification phase of these transactions and working cooperatively. And the strategy is really around what's the best way we can do that to really persuade them on the merits of these cases, and a little less around kind of the strategic calling of the question that you might have in the U.S. in terms of certifying compliance with the second request or other things like that.
So timing in Europe, how do you work with the timing that they have and the timing in the U.S., where you have deals that require both agencies to review? Is there a strategic thought process that goes into which agency you want to sort of approach first, or how you approach the two agencies together? How do you think about that?
It's tough to get them synced up to exactly the same schedule, just because of the serious differences between the processes. But I think what we see is there are some, it depends on the case, basically.
Sure.
And it depends in particular on the case teams that you have and the particular personalities that are on each side. And sometimes you want one to be a little ahead of the other, depending on who you're in front of and who you think would be receptive to their arguments. But our ability to control the timing in the US through the second request compliance really helps sync things up if you want to keep things relatively simultaneous. And so, we see with the extended pre-notification process in Europe, a ability to delay the time when the filing happens. But once that happens, we follow a reasonably fixed timeline, with the exception of stop the clocks here or there. But if you get to a point where you've agreed with the case team that you're finally going to file, you can usually work the second request compliance or your timing agreement on the U.S. side to keep things roughly at the same pace. Sometimes that's not possible because of other factors that the clients have to deal with, such as works councils, for example, in France, where they view the filing of the HSR as probably a more significant act than maybe it really is, and in those cases it's a little more challenging.
So let me just ask, I don't know the answer to this. I've only worked on the U.S. side, so I'm very familiar with the second request process and how documents get called for and produced and reviewed. How does it work in Europe as far as sort of how they ask for documents and what they expect you to do, and if you comply or don't comply? How do they sort of enforce compliance with their document requests?
Yeah, so it's really, document requests, frankly, are something that was a bit foreign to the European process as it was originally envisioned when they passed the merger regulation. And it was really a process built around the parties and their counsel providing information to the commission in a detailed upfront filing that eliminated a lot of the need for follow-on work after that, and that they could use that filing as a vehicle to have everything they needed to make the decision. I mean, was it ever 100% true in reality? No, of
Probably
course
not,
not.
yeah.
But that was really the idea. And I think in part through exchanges and seeing how the US prosecutes cases, the commission over time has come to appreciate the importance of internal documents in not only exposing kind of the thoughts of the parties about the deal, but also about competition just in the ordinary course of business. But the process was never really built to handle extensive document requests. And so they've kind of been grafted on top of that. The commission does have the power to issue requests for information to the parties under Article 11 of the merger regulation, and to set deadlines for them to respond to those. And so the process that has started to grow up with the commission is that they'll send requests for information that ask you to search internal documents. And they impose relatively tight timelines around those. And they have the ability to stop the clock or even to fine you if you don't comply with those in the time that they give you. It's actually become quite a problem for us, for everyone really, in the process, because a bit of a practice of the commission specifying who your custodians should be and what terms you should use to search their files in the information request itself, and then setting a timeline of something around the order of 2 weeks to search them, which I think anybody who's worked on U.S. discovery issues knows is not really an adequate amount of time to, frankly, to even do privilege review, let alone to do anything else.
Right.
So, I think there are people in the commission that realize that's not an ideal process, and there are some case teams that we've been working with, including one we're working on now, to get drafts of those and maybe work through a slightly more reasonable process that gets the commission better information ultimately, and doesn't put the parties in that awkward position. But it's really something, the whole document review process, I mean, is really something that is foreign and has kind of been grafted on top of the European process as it is.
Yeah, so it sounds like they had or started at least with a much more robust HSR kind of filing that had to be made. The U.S. sort of lets you make a minimal kind of filing and then follows it up with a massive document request if they think there's something to investigate.
It's really quite divergent approaches, but unfortunately we're kind of converging on the worst of both worlds in Europe right now. Yeah.
All right, so let me shift gears a little bit.
Sure.
How would you describe the current European approach to non-horizontal mergers? We're obviously seeing a lot of stuff going on in the U.S. At this point, or at least a lot of talk in the U.S. and one very prominent case. The case that we were thinking about in Europe that seemed interesting to us was the Qualcomm NXP case, which went to phase 2 with pretty extensive remedies, but didn't draw anywhere near that kind of scrutiny in the U.S. So what's the current thinking or approach on non-horizontal mergers in the European Union?
So I think that when it comes to more traditional vertical mergers, there's not that much of a divergence between the two agencies. And by that I mean where we're talking about two companies where one directly supplies an input to another or to its competitors. Where we have seen a big difference, and this is where Qualcomm NXP is a prime example, is in what we call in Europe conglomerate cases, where the parties they make products that are not direct inputs into one another, but they are complements that are sold together. And in Qualcomm NXP, that was on the one hand the cellular LTE baseband modem, and on the from Qualcomm, and on the other hand from NXP the near field communication and secure element chips that also go into the phone. And the concern in many of those cases is that the parties after the merger will have an incentive to tie or bundle together those two complementary products, and that'll result in foreclosure of their competitors. When Steve Salop and I were writing an article about revising the vertical merger guidelines in the U.S., one of the policy questions that we were thinking about is should the same standard be applied to complementary products cases, the same kind of cases that are called conglomerate cases in the U.S. And the economics of the two are really quite similar. It turns out that the fact that one person buys the input from another and then assembles it and sells it to the end consumer versus the end consumer buying two products themselves and using them together is not particularly significant in terms of the overall economics of it.
Right.
But there are some pretty important legal differences. And I think this is where the U.S. agencies have kind of parted ways with their European colleagues, because the important legal difference, of course, is that tying and bundling are themselves things that we can go after ex post, after the merger is completed,
Right.
At least if certain conditions are met.
Right.
And so there's, I think, in the U.S. a much greater desire to rely on that ex post enforcement in these conglomerate cases, and frankly, most of the sections that I've dealt with at the DOJ and the FTC really don't view it as a serious theory of harm to be pursued in these cases for exactly that reason, that they have these ex post tools to go after it.
So it's kind of interesting. I mean, it sounds similar to the situation with GE and Honeywell years ago, where the U.S. agencies diverged from the Europeans, and the Europeans took a much different approach, and that caused a lot of friction and tension between the Europeans and the American enforcement agencies, and that still hasn't been resolved. That still is sort of an open wound in a way. They haven't sort of converged and come to an understanding of each other in terms of which one is the better approach.
Yeah, it is. Right? it is still an open wound. I think there's two components really of that GE Honeywell case too, right? I mean, one is kind of the efficiencies offense in that case, and a concern about the combined company because of the efficiencies of the deal potentially driving all of its competitors out of business. And that I think is something that the Commission has largely moved on from. But the conglomerate theory in that case is something that they still are pursuing to this day. And I think the remedies imposed in the Qualcomm and XP case demonstrate that they are still quite serious about pursuing those theories. But it is an open point of discussion between them. And I know that the folks at the agencies here in the U.S., when they're working on cases and cooperating and having discussions with their European colleagues, even on the same merger, they're topics of debate and active debate, as they're talking through those. And frankly, sometimes the U.S. agencies are successful in convincing the Europeans that there isn't likely to be harm when these theories are proposed. And I know that just from hearing kind of a little bit of a debriefings after the fact in other cases about those conversations that happened.
It's good at least that they're paying attention and listening to each other, I guess.
I actually think people underrate how much you can get, in particular the U.S. agencies, to work on your behalf with other agencies around the world. Once you've convinced them that your transaction isn't problematic, and that still happens even in Europe, which is another obviously quite mature enforcer. I actually think it's an underrated strategic tool that people ought to use more often, and you should really think about as you're choosing how you're dealing with the agencies.
Right. Well, it's always nice if you can get the U.S. agencies to agree with you that the deal is not a problem. And then a smaller agency or even a similar sized agency has got to sort of think long and hard if they're going to go it alone on a thing. one of the things that has obviously been a concern in the U.S. is that we've had some pretty spectacular merger remedy failures. Do you see in Europe any trend towards a more hawkish approach to remedies, the way we have sort of seen and heard talk about in the U.S. Because of the problems that some of the studies have shown with merger remedies failing after the fact?
Yeah, I don't think we've seen quite as much of a high-profile remedy failures that have gotten the same kind of press that's happened in the U.S. In particular, like grocery stores and others, and rental cars. But the same trend is there, and I think if you look back, even 5-ish years ago, pretty much all the commission remedies were post-closing. With a post-closing sale of a divestiture. And that's really not the case anymore. I think in particular, we've really seen a push by the Commission to almost always requiring buyers up front in an effort to really get a handle on whether there's actually going to be a market for some of the divested assets in the past and in these transactions. And also a greater push towards broader divestitures that include more of the supplemental assets, the supporting assets of the business. Really more of a push towards standalone businesses. And the U.S. trend has really, I think, had an influence on them as well, and they've had an influence on the U.S. Too. So it's kind of a mutually reinforcing trend, I think, as you look at both sides of the Atlantic.
So, but we don't have in Europe any sort of great examples of things where the Commission has proposed a remedy, implemented it, and it didn't succeed for one reason or another. I mean, this is always the problem, I think, in the U.S. when you look back. Businesses make decisions all the time, regardless of whether they've merged or not, that sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. Sometimes a business will fail spectacularly, has nothing to do with any sort of merger. So always sort of blaming the merger remedy on the reason the business fails seems to miss the point that businesses fail all the time. Do we have any examples in Europe of merger remedy failure, or have they pretty much avoided the problems the U.S. has had?
I think we really don't have any examples of the spectacular types of merger failures that have really gotten splashed across the headlines in the U.S. And so they've largely avoided that. Have there been instances where they've not gotten everything they've wanted, or where it's been a lot harder to sell assets than they really thought it would? I mean, there are some examples, for example, where parties have had to put money into a business actually to even get buyers for it. To me, that always suggests maybe those assets were going to be shut down in a standalone world anyway, since they weren't earning a return on capital. But I think we've seen some quieter instances like that where the Commission really hasn't, they haven't seen a remedy succeed in the way they would have liked, but not in a splashed across the headlines
kind of way.
Well,
that's good. All right, so I'm going to get back to timing a little bit. It seems that we've seen the EC suspend the clock on a number of high-profile mergers, sometimes due to a party's failure to supply documents or some other issue that they had with the parties complying with their requests. It seems so. If we're seeing an uptick in the Europeans stopping the clock, to what should we attribute that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to your observation about the fixed set of timelines that they have in the merger regulation. Like any agency, the Commission always feels like they don't have enough time. And in the U.S. we have the second request process, and that imposes a burden on the parties to move the transaction forward. And we have the threat of litigation afterwards, which is going to impose some delay and brings the parties to the table to really talk about timing in a way that the Commission just doesn't have the freedom to do once the filing is actually on file. And so I think that's really what's behind a lot of the stop the clock actions we've seen. As I mentioned before, the way that the document requests are structured in terms of how the commission delivers them to the parties, in a lot of instances, to be candid, it's impossible to meet the deadlines that are set out in the commission's RFIs, and that's not entirely accidental. By an agency that just feels like they need more time to look through things. So I think we see often, and unfortunately, the commission, when they do issue a stop the clock, it goes up on the website and it's publicly reported, and the stock market takes note of that, and then you have the clients calling because their executives are calling them, and investors are calling them. It's not great, but I think people are actually overreading what that really means in the scope of the process.
Are the Europeans able to issue more than one document request to a party? In the U.S., it's pretty much the second request and you're done. That's all they're going to ask for. They may ask for depositions, but basically as far as documents, once the second request is issued, you know what you have to produce and that's it. With the Europeans, can they continue to ask for additional documents, or do they also have a one document request sort of policy with respect to the merging parties?
I wish they did, but they don't. There's no limit, and they can issue as many RFIs as they want, and they can, and they do. And I think in some very large transactions, we've seen even through phase 2, getting one a week. Sometimes getting them on Friday nights with a 48-hour turnaround and other things like that. And so, no, unfortunately, there's not, and it can make things a little unpleasant.
So every time they issue a request, it extends the clock as well, I assume.
Not every time they issue, only if you don't comply with the deadline. And they take a formal decision to stop the clock. So it's really a lot of it comes down to the relationship with the case team, to having had a long enough pre-notification to get things to a place where people feel comfortable with the timing and feel like they have enough time, and working cooperatively. But there are always situations where you need to push people to make a decision, and they don't want to be pushed to make a decision on the timeline you've given them, and you just have to power through it. And so it is one of the things you just have to live with. It's part of the process today, and do the best you can to not give them the grounds to be able to do it, or give them the grounds to be able to do it if they're really going to make good use of the time. Are there ways that you can control the clock in Europe the way you can in the U.S. with timing agreements and so forth? I mean, the phase 1 and phase 2 have sort of defined time periods. Are there other ways that you have available to you that you can sort of control the clock in Europe the way we can in the U.S.? Not to the same extent. I think your primary tool for being able to control the clock is the length of that pre-notification period before you put the filing in. Where you're talking to the case team, you're already giving them information and working with them, but you haven't formally put the filing in and started those time clocks. That's really your primary lever to work with. There are, of course, some other things you can do. We already talked about letting them stop the clock, essentially, to give them a bit more time. And of course, in phase 2, you have the ability to grant them a one-time extension, short extension of time. But it's certainly nowhere near the flexibility, near unlimited flexibility you have, to negotiate a timing agreement in the U.S. There are, of course, pros and cons with that. The flexibility to do it means the agencies here always ask for it.
Right.
But it is something that is a kind of a strategic arrow you have in the U.S. process that isn't quite as flexible over there.
So how long, just in Europe, how long do the Europeans generally take to review documents that you've produced? Is there a deadline for them in terms of getting sort of a decision, and after they've sort of had your documents for a certain amount of time, the way there is in the U.S., where there's a 30-day clock that, yes, you can stop it, but there's a 30-day clock that the agencies have to abide by if there's no timing agreement.
Yeah, I mean, there's no real formal, in terms of nothing formally tied to when you provide them documents. I mean, of course, there's the overall 90 working day time limit in phase 2, and 25 working days in phase 1. And that kind of puts around them a time frame where they need to make decisions about things, but there's not this close connection to the production of documents and evidence that there is in the U.S. timing.
All right, last question. So any expectations about how things will go between the Europeans and the American enforcement authorities as the new administration sort of finally gets filled out with the confirmation of the new FTC commissioners?
Yeah, I think it's really been surprising that the news is no surprises. We've seen really a movement as business as usual from both sides. I think that the biggest issue where we're likely to see divergence going forward is on the intersection between antitrust and IP. The Commission has really been very vocal in the importance of FRAND, not just as a contractual right, but as an antitrust principle in standard setting and applying to standard essential patents. And they continue to move aggressively down that path and to monitor and take enforcement actions. And I think we've heard from the DOJ in particular, that that's not their view of the world now, that the world has shifted too far in favor of implementers, and that we ought to be more cognizant of the harms that can befall patent holders in the standard setting context. And so, I think we even see now the DOJ opening an investigation into working groups within the IEEE, and whether the implementers use their buying power, essentially, informing the standard to get a better deal than would have happened in a competitive situation. And so I think we could see on that issue in particular, really decisions working at cross purposes in terms of how the law develops. That's really, for me, the biggest issue where we're likely to see a clash in the time going forward.
Okay. All right, Daniel, thank you very, very much for taking time to talk with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.